Imagine your job is selling ice cream on the beach. You can choose, you have your little red cart and you can choose wherever you want to go and put it. Well, where should you sell it? You can choose anywhere along the beach. We can assume that customers are going to come, whenever they come, but they're kind of equally likely to come from any point in the beach. Well, if we consider a competitor as well, this is actually a very classic economics problem. And I've made a small game to kind of show what's going on here. So let's start running our simulation and we can see that the customers are going to go to whichever cart is closest. You can see here that at the moment the red cart is getting a little bit more demand because it's taking up a larger share of the beach. More customers are closer to the red cart than they are to the green cart. So consider this first situation, right, where they're both at opposite ends of the beach. Here you can see, right down the middle is where we have what we call this indifference line, where all the customers to the left of this line are going to go left, and all the customers to the right of this line are going to go right, and the competitors are splitting the market equally. Well, the problem here is that this is not what we would call a stable equilibrium, because there's no incentive for red and green to stay in this situation, right? Let's imagine you're running this little red cart. Would you actually stay in this position if you were selling the ice cream? Well, the answer is no, right? Because as soon as you start moving left, you're going to capture more and more of that market. So the closer you get to the middle of the beach, you're actually getting now way more than half the market. So there's no point staying over here right on the end of the beach when you may as well just keep moving over and getting closer and stealing more of the competitors. And actually, if the green cart doesn't move at all, your best strategy is going to be to sit right next to him here, where now you're getting the whole beach coming to you, and green is only getting this tiny, tiny little portion of demand from people at the very end of the beach. You're getting, almost the entire market. So actually what we can think of as a competitive equilibrium would be something like this, where both carts are positioned right in the center, and everybody has to go all the way to the middle of the beach to buy their ice cream. So this is something, where basically the carts offer very little differentiation, right? And this is kind of what this model is very good at showing, is thinking about how do companies differentiate their products. Do they provide a very different offering, or do they provide a very similar offering? And at least in this situation, what we would end up with is that the carts would be very, very close to each other. And that means that the product offering is very similar, but this is actually a stable equilibrium, right? Red doesn't have any incentive to move left because he's just giving more of the market to green. And similarly, green doesn't have any incentive to move right or to move left because he's not getting any more demand than he gets from sitting right in the middle. Now, a useful thought experiment in economics is what would happen if this was a monopolist, right? What would happen if I controlled both of these carts and my goal was just to maximize sale or, maximize kind of consumer welfare? Well, what we would actually have is a situation more like this, where both carts are positioned at kind of 1/4 and 3/4 of the way along the beach. And you can see that they split the demand equally, but more importantly, think about how far the customers have to walk. So whereas with this situation, the customers have to walk half the length of the beach, there's the customers that are spawning at the very end of the beach have to walk all the way to the middle to get their ice cream. If we have this situation, customers on average, the furthest they have to walk is 1/4 of the length of the beach. So actually, if we think about the cost of the consumers who have to walk along the beach, they're tired, they just want to get the ice cream and chill in the sun. This is actually optimal from a kind of government perspective, if we had a central planner that could organize everything. So this is one of these situations in economics where we see that competitive dynamics, so the fact that red and green are not owned by the same company, this actually leads to them wanting to come closer. Red's incentive is to move over here and capture more demand. Green's incentive is to move over here and capture more demand. What we end up with is that scenario right here, right? Where they start out really far apart, but the incentives push them closer together, and they keep pushing them closer together until they end up right in the middle. Now, the other thing we can do with this model is look at prices. So at the moment, what I've assumed is that actually A and B are both charging the same price. The customers are just going to go to the ice cream that's the closest to them. But of course, when you're a firm selling ice cream, normally you have a choice of both the location you're going to be on the beach, but also the price you set. So we can see here, for instance, if A lowers their price, what's going to happen? Well, the indifference line, the kind of the point at which customers will go to A rather than B, is going to shift right. So, you see here that this little guy started going the other way. This is because when the prices were the same, he would have happily gone to B. But now that A is a little bit lower in price, he's still going. He's willing to walk a little bit further to get to A. Now, of course, B is still getting some demand, right? Because what's happening is that the customers over here, they can see that A is 50 cents cheaper, but B is a whole lot closer. So there's this what we call transport cost. This is kind of the cost to the consumer from moving from their current location. So in some cases, we might imagine that customers don't really care. They're happy to walk a long way. In other cases, they might be very unwilling to walk a long way. And what the customers are doing is they're optimizing that decision between, should I travel further for a lower price, or should I go for the one that's closer? And we can see, for instance, as I keep lowering the price, now B is only getting this very small portion of the market, people over here. But what we can see is that actually if we change the transport cost, so let me just set that down to like 50 cents difference. Well, if the transport cost goes up, now suddenly that line, that indifference line is going to start shifting left, because the customers who, when the transport cost is very low, they're very willing to kind of walk all the way across the beach. But actually, as that transport cost increases, suddenly B becomes more attractive again. So this is another kind of factor we can think about when we model this. And yeah, so obviously this is a model. It's known as the Hotelling model in economics. This is very useful for thinking about what we would call horizontal product differentiation, right? So this is product differentiation where it doesn't really cost you anything to change the way that you offer your product. So we could think about, positioning along a waterfront, or we could think about something in your product quality that it doesn't really cost you any more or any less to produce it one way or the other, but you have competitors that you're competing against. And this would be a case where, the carts have wheels. It's very, very easy to move your cart and move your location. The other way of thinking about it is, maybe this is kind of what we would call a two-stage game. So if the competitors have to choose the location first and then sell products afterwards, it would actually be very, very different dynamics. And there's actually some equilibrium where you get this kind of situation one where if you can't move your cart, then what you actually want to do is set them very, very far apart, because what you're then doing is basically you're getting your own monopoly. So in the case where you set the location first and then you can choose the prices, then you might want to be very, very far apart, because you get your own little monopoly, you can raise your prices, you can earn a lot more money. But in this case here, in this kind of dynamic setting where you're free to change your location, that just isn't sustainable. So this is what we would call unstable in economics, where there's no incentive for those carts to stay in the same location. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. This is just a really simple example, but I think it kind of shows how often you will get firms that, even though they have a choice of ways that they can offer products, the result might actually be that they just end up very, very similarly located. They have all this space to differentiate their product, but what the final result is actually that you end up just sitting in the middle of the market, because that most customers are going to come to you, but it just doesn't make sense to kind of cater to these people. The other thing, of course, we're assuming here is that all the customers are actually willing to buy the good at the price, right? So it might be that if you spawn over here, the transport cost is so high that you won't even bother walking. And that's something we're not really modeling here, but of course you can kind of factor that in as well, and that leads to some different dynamics. But yeah, so this is the Hotelling model, and this is kind of how you should think about selling ice cream on the beach.